Okay, so our next speaker is an award-winning Ngāi Tahu historian, famous most of all for his humility. Sorry, I misread that. Famous most of all for his availability. A few weeks ago, Tā Tipuni asked me if I would like to compose and deliver a Waitangi Day address, he told me I would be, which is to say, of course, that Lady Sandra had told Tipuni that he wouldn't be. So in that sense, I offer my sincere thanks to you, Sandra, for this wonderful opportunity. And I further thank Te Rau Aroha for acquiescing to her proposal. Before I begin, though, I'd like to acknowledge you, Tipuni, for the nearly 30 occasions in which you have stood before us to share your knowledge and views of the Treaty of Waitangi on this, its commemorative day. Looking back through those carefully crafted kōrero, one sees that on every occasion you taught us something about our past, but in a way that helped us to better understand our present, before pushing us, often forcefully, to think about our future and what might be. E tā, without preemptively composing your obituary, because you're still very much with us and you're still very much with it, I want to suggest a parallel with Tāwhiao. Like him, you provided your people with strong leadership during a tumultuous period of New Zealand's history, but in so doing, you've reflected on the nature of leadership, of strategy, of aspiration, and gifted us visionary words, passages, sayings, and ideas which will continue to warm our bones long after yours have gone cold. And nowhere are these great gifts more apparent than your Waitangi Day addresses. So in concluding this brief mihi to you, Tipuni, I offer a quote from the Roman statesman, philosopher, and orator Cicero: "What nobler employment or more valuable to the state than that of the man who instructs the rising generation." I now begin my address proper, and I do so again by reaching for Cicero. Quote, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child." Political discourse in New Zealand, particularly in the area of Māori and Pākehā relations, the nature, extent and legacy of colonial era wrongs can, a la Cicero, all too often be described as childish. That is to say, many of our politicians and political commentators, perhaps most of them, and I include a number of Māori in this assessment, are profoundly ignorant of the history of this archipelago. And I single out the Honourable Megan Woods as an exception to this rule. Armed with a PhD in history, she's consequently one of our least childish politicians. Which is one reason why we're so thrilled to have her here with us today. But my general point holds. Few New Zealanders know much about New Zealand. Were that not so, the racialised Christchurch terror attacks, the existential threats posed by COVID-19 and climate change would not, as they so often are, be described as unprecedented. What then does this have to do with Te Tiriti o Waitangi? Well, I'm simply suggesting that while we can, at this point in time, trust the state to care for the treaty as an object, as illustrated by the 9 documents' current purpose-built home in the National Library, I think we need to take personal responsibility for the treaty as a subject. Put differently, while we should applaud the government for introducing New Zealand history into the school curriculum, we should not allow it to have a monopoly over the creation and the dissemination of that history. I say that very mindful of what Tipuni refers to as the New Zealand state's triennial lobotomy. Let us also remember that in 1908, when the state effectively enjoyed such a monopoly, the treaty documents were discovered to have been carelessly stored under government buildings, where they were damaged by water and chewed on by rats after having been pissed on by the judiciary. It was careful historical scholarship, determined historical advocacy, and historically informed politics by Māori and Pākehā figures, that's a nod to Tim's comment earlier, which helped recover the treaty's status and transform it from a rat-nibbled nullity, to quote Tipuni again, to the nation's proverbial founding document. And this brings me to my next observation and attendant recommendation. As an increasing number of New Zealanders seek to understand the history of these islands, and I applaud Stuff and other parts of our media for recent advances in that regard, it seems to me that they use the treaty as a way into our history. Now, Of course, that's no bad thing, but I think it would be much better, a good thing, if people flip that around and instead use our history as a way into better understanding the treaty. Simply put, this is a text best read in context. And that is as true of events in the 1840s as those in the 1940s, and indeed those in the 1990s that we heard about earlier in Martin's book. It is by such means, I think, that we can better comprehend and potentially enhance the treaty's role in New Zealand society beyond imprecise symbolism. Understanding our history and the treaty in this way requires us to do two things: to look up and out to the wider world, as well as deeper down into the particular regions and subnational entities that cumulatively constitute New Zealand. Let me put it this way. Imagine, if you will, the Treaty of Waitangi as a house in which we all live. It's surely not an original metaphor, but I want to extend it to assert that we spend quite a bit of time, those of us who live in the house, arguing over the wallpaper, the curtains and the carpet, who gets what bedroom, whose turn it is to do the dishes. All the while, barely anyone looks down to check the piles, let alone geotechnical conditions, or looks up to check the roof, let alone the rain forecast. Put differently, most of what passes as treaty discourse is conceived of at the national level. This is, I suggest, a natural consequence of the orthodox view that the treaty is only a source of law to the extent that it is incorporated into New Zealand's domestic legal system, that is to say, woven into statutes by Parliament, which is, of course, how the very notion of the principles of the treaty emerged in the mid-1970s and developed through the 1980s. However, the elements by which the treaty was born, then neglected, and then revived, are for the most part local and transnational rather than national. Our collective ignorance of that dynamic is perhaps both cause and effect of the way in which reappraisals of New Zealand's colonial history over the last 40 or so years have taken place surprisingly independent of the British imperial history of which it was a part. I suspect that this was a consequence of New Zealand's settler colonial elite domesticating the treaty in the 1870s so as to kill it, which was perfectly observable in 1903's protest of the bench and bar. While that legal case alone, I think, is one of the most interesting parts of our legal history, in the interest of time and the fact that the real expert on that part of our history, Emeritus Professor David Williams, is in the audience, I'm just going to move on. I turn instead to offer a key example of some of the transnational forces to which I've just referred. In several of his Waitangi Day addresses, Tā Tipene has noted what he calls, quote, the elevated decency of Norman B's instructions to Hobson, end quote. Tipene is referring to Lord Normanby, who was briefly the Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1839, and the detailed instructions he gave to William Hobson, who had been tasked with formally incorporating New Zealand into the British Empire. Now, these instructions specified the need for a treaty of cession with Māori, which was to be obtained through Māori consent rather than British force. Moreover, Hobson was instructed to recognise and protect Māori land and property, and as part of that, the Crown was only to purchase land from Māori that it could, quote, obtain by fair and equal contracts, end quote, and these would be overseen by Pākehā protectors, whose job it was to safeguard Māori interests, as indeed occurred at Otako, this is the first major Ngāi Tahu land sale in 1844. Now, one of these so-called protectors of Aborigines, of course, was Edward Shortland, who travelled through Te Waipounamu in 1843-44, met with several of our tipuna, including here at Awaroa and across at Ruapuki Island. Shortland quickly grappled with Ngāi Tahu whakapapa and land tenure, and he devised fairly enlightened frameworks for the potential sale of Māori land and British settlement. Unfortunately, though, George Grey disbanded the Protectorate Office in 1846, which helps explain why we were treated so poorly 2 years later with Kemp's purchase. Significantly, Shortland consistently rejected the idea of Māori depopulation, which of course was popularly asserted by Pākehā to justify the appropriation of Māori land and the increasing irrelevance of the treaty, a sort of rebus sextentibus. Shortland, in contrast, argued that the so-called dying Māori thesis was a fallacy, this is a quote, a fallacy likely to mislead the intending colonist, right, who could not use it to justify acting disadvantageously on the native race, who are highly intellectual human beings who will eventually take their place side by side with the white man as equals, end quote. In other words, if not duty, then long-term self-interest should inspire Pākehā to do right by Māori. A similar logic, I suggest, probably sits behind the modern treaty settlement process, while the delay in accepting that elemental truth most definitely sits behind our unconscionable Māori incarceration rates. Anyway, my bigger point here, which is what Tipene was getting at, is that Normanby's instructions were essentially the basis for Te Tiriti. The next important point is this. Normanby's contribution to the so-called Normanby's instructions was simply limited to his signature. They had been effectively approved by his predecessor, Lord Glenelg, who had been Secretary of State for the colonies between 1835 and 1839. More to the point, the instructions were drafted by Sir James Stephen, who worked in the Colonial Office for over 3 decades and who was the Under-Secretary of the State for Colonies between 1836 and 1847. Now, both Glenelg, Normanby's predecessor, and Stephen, the Under-Secretary, were key members in the humanitarian movement, right, which was a trans-imperial network of mainly evangelical Anglicans, but also some Quakers, who successfully abolished the slave trade within the British Empire in 1807, and then slavery itself in 1834. Now, the legislation that achieved the latter was actually drafted by Sir James Stephen, who worked very closely with Thomas Fowell Buxton, who had succeeded William Wilberforce in the House of Commons as the leader of the abolitionist movement. Buxton, who was the founding chair of the RSPCA, if it comes up in a pub quiz, but really the point is about these are people who wanted to limit cruelty to other people and animals alike. So Buxton and other leading humanitarians, having to some extent dealt with the issue of slavery, then extended their focus to the treatment and the status of Indigenous people on both the formal and informal frontiers of the British Empire. Reflecting on his life's work in this regard, Stephen, in a letter to Buxton, wrote that, quote, "I am thankful for the innumerable opportunities which have been afforded me of contributing to the mitigation, if not the prevention, of the cruel wrongs which our country has inflicted on so large a portion of the human race." In 1835, by which time New Zealand and Māori were deeply entangled in the British imperial world, Buxton established the Parliamentary Select Committee on Aborigines in the House of Commons. This was sparked by frontier violence between British farmer settlers and Hausa in the Cape Colony, i.e. South Africa, between 1835 and 1837, but it became a general inquiry into the activities of British settlers and traders there, as well as at New South Wales, Tasmania, New Zealand, and various other Pacific islands, and what we now call Canada. As one historian notes, the resultant report, the Buxton report, quote, applied to British settlers and traders the same language that had so recently been brought to bear against slave owners. The report castigated settlers and traders for their immoral treatment of Indigenous peoples and argued that such treatment contributed to the physical destruction and moral degradation of, quote, the native inhabitants of the countries where British settlements are made. Now, amongst other things, the report proposed the metropolitan, which is to say British, the imperial core, oversight of settler relationships with Indigenous people, and interestingly, at that point in time, argued against the use of treaties on the basis that they would be used against the Indigenous contracting party by settlers. That said, humanitarians, including Sir James Stephen, later changed their mind on this point, in part because of events that took place within New Zealand, and specifically within Te Waipounamu and Ngaitahu, which I will touch on shortly. In any event, Buxton and Stephen, and I would add Edward Shortland, and even the likes of Reverend Octavius Hadfield, believed in the possibility and the desirability of British expansion motivated by duty rather than self-interest, of benevolent colonisation, even if that sounds like an oxymoron to our ears. Another consequence of the Buxton Report was the establishment of the Aborigines Protection Society, which in today's language would be called like the Indigenous Rights Society, something like that, which worked hard to achieve the aims of the Buxton Report, and whose membership included Frederick Tuckett, he of the Otago Purchase, who returned to Britain, became a vocal critic of the New Zealand Company, and provided sustained material support to Reverend Vola's and the Ruapuki mission. So where am I going with this? Well, from a Māori vantage, the timing of all this activity is clearly crucial. Sir James Stephen had the strongest influence on the Colonial Office during Lord Glenelg's administration, so that 1835 to 1839 block, which was precisely when the Colonial Office, or Britain, were deciding what the heck to do with New Zealand. The point being that had that occurred earlier in time, or later in time, a very different looking treaty could have been offered up to Māori, or indeed no treaty whatsoever. So what unfolded after 1840, of course, was not good, but I'm convinced it could have easily been so much worse. And we can give thanks that it wasn't worse by increasing our understanding of those sort of historical factors. Now, you will not be surprised to learn that the New Zealand Company and Edward Gibbon Wakefield were deeply opposed to humanitarians and humanitarianism. They were deeply opposed to the humanitarian-inflected Colonial Office and personally found Sir James Stephen abhorrent. You will not be surprised that Sir James Stephen was similarly scornful of Wakefield's plans for so-called systematic colonisation. I won't go into the detail of any of that, except to note three things. First, Stephen and Wakefield both sought to reform the British Empire, but one did so from the point of view of what was best for Britain, while the other did so in terms of what was best, or at least bad, for Indigenous people ensnared within that empire. In other words, Wakefield and Stephen had competing visions of empire, and that tension is clearly visible by the time we get to 1840 and the Treaty of Waitangi. As Claudia Orange observes, initial plans for a Māori New Zealand that somehow accommodated European settlers was replaced with a settler New Zealand that would somehow retain a place for Māori. Secondly, despite the deep antagonism that existed between Wakefield and his supporters and Buxton and his supporters, the fact is that Wakefield's grandmother, Priscilla Bell, the noted educationist, feminist and writer, who was a grandmother of the Quaker banker David Barclay, had a sister, Catherine, who married another Quaker banker, John Gurney, bear with me, whose children included the prison and slavery reformers Joseph Gurney, Elizabeth Fry and Hannah Gurney. Hannah Gurney was married to none other than Thomas Fowell Buxton. Right, so basically this was just a big family scrap. What to do with New Zealand? So, the core elements of that story, cousin fighting cousin over the question of territorial expansion, it's all very eerily reminiscent of the Ngāi Tahu migration narrative. So, not only do we not need to seriously rework British history into a Māori intellectual framework to make it intelligible, a la 1966's Shakespeare in the Bush, I think that take on Wakefield and Buxton illustrates the extreme utility of whakapapa in crafting Pākehā history as well as Māori history. My final point on the Wakefield versus Buxton visions of empire is that they were able to hold these views, that is, debate how to best rule land in far-flung parts of the world, precisely because Britain ruled the world's seas. I think that point is often forgotten. That was the true source of Pax Britannica, naval supremacy. To quote New Zealand's 10th governor, the military engineer Sir William Jarvis, from an 1884 lecture in Wellington, quote, "Naval squadrons are maintained in the British Channel, in the Mediterranean, in the North American and West Indian Command, in the Pacific, in China, on the East India Station, at the Cape of Good Hope, and last not least, Australasia. These are charged with the defence of British interests and of the lines of British commerce throughout the world." End quote. Simply put, Britain had the thing that the United States of America currently has, and which the People's Republic of China is working hard to acquire. One of the naval bases that made this British global military network possible was Singapore, whose fall in 1942, for reasons as much personal as professional, I think marked the end of the British Empire. In any event, it is no coincidence that Hobson came from the Royal Navy. Likewise, his immediate successor, New Zealand's second Governor, Robert Fitzroy. It is no coincidence that the Governor-General's message was delivered to us today by Commander Melissa Ross of the Royal New Zealand Navy. Commodore, you represent an interesting heritage and you operate in interesting times. As I turn to conclude this address, let me preemptively rebut the accusation that much of the foregoing is a long way from Ruapuki Island, from Ōtākau and from Ōnuku, the three sites where Ngāi Tahu Rangatira signed the treaty in mid-1840. I mentioned earlier that Buxton and Stephen, and the British government more generally, felt increasingly empowered to intervene in New Zealand as the 1830s unfolded. A key reason for this, which resulted in the appointment of James Busby as British resident in Waitangi, 1833, and eventually, of course, Te Tiriti, were the atrocities committed at Takapūneke in November 1830 by Ngāti Toa and the British captain and crew of the Elizabeth. As we Ngāi Tahu know only too well, this resulted in the capture, the torture and the deaths of Te Mai Haranui, his wife Te Whare, and their daughter Ngā Roimata. Please remember that Kātiraki Āmoa lines reach down into here in Murihiku through two sisters of Te Mai Haranui, Wairua and Piki, who both have descendants here today. A descendant of Wairua is Riki Topi, who caught and cooked the pāua you ate for lunch. A descendant of Piki is my paua, who just wishes I would stop talking. But before I do, let me also point out that the oyster boat owned and operated by Te Rūnaka o Awaroa is named Ngā Roimata, after that girl who was killed. As William Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead, it is not even past. Let me also thank the Christchurch City Council and our whanaukau at Ōnuku, who secured ownership of the so-called Red House adjacent to the Takapūneke Reserve in December last year, thereby enabling us, all of us, to enhance this enormously significant historical site. It is that sort of material investment in our collective past and therefore collective future that fills me with all sorts of optimism. I suspect it was a similar sort of optimism our tipuna felt in the 1920s when Sir William Alexander Sim carefully and sympathetically assessed Kemp's purchase and arguably helped lay the foundations for the iwi corporate Ngāi Tahu as we know it today. And on that note, I would like to point out that one of Sir William's mokopuna kindly sits amongst us here today. 3 years ago, Tā Tipuni stood before you here and asked, is there a place for the Treaty of Waitangi in the dramatically changed world that is upon us, or is it simply an historic artefact and past its use-by date? I will not summarise his answer, but instead offer my own. I quite agree with Thomas Jefferson's 1789 comment to James Madison that, quote, no society can make a perpetual constitution or even a perpetual law. The earth belongs always to the living generation. But I also note that the New Zealand state has been at its worst when disregarding Te Tiriti o Waitangi and at its best when seeking to give effect to it. I say that with local government and the Department of Conservation firmly in mind on both counts. So, riffing off Jefferson, I think that in New Zealand it is not just the earth but also the treaty that belongs to living generations. And to fully appreciate and manage both of those things, the land and the treaty, which is pivotal to the durability of the treaty settlement process, we need to grow our understanding of history, of what came before us. We all need to be less ignorant, less childish. To do otherwise brings to mind Heraclitus, dogs bark at what they cannot understand. Near the beginning of this talk, by now no doubt a distant memory, I argued that the treaty is a house. With that in mind, and standing at the bully pulpit of this house, which is a testament to mutually beneficial Māori and Pākehā interaction, let me simply close by quoting Churchill. We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. Kia ora tātou.